suppose we'll get started. Yeah. So good afternoon. Thanks for coming. My name is Conal O'Shea. I'm a nephrologist here in Beaumont. I've just started here last month, so most of you won't have met me before, but thanks for coming along to this. So today I'm going to talk about some tips and advice for writing a good scientific paper. And I understand from Francis that you're all in the process maybe of writing up a report on some clinical projects you've been involved in. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is really geared towards writing scientific papers for publication, but I see there's a very big overlap. So I think this will be very relevant to you, but don't feel overwhelmed if it seems a little maybe higher level than you're used to. And stop me at any point if you've got questions. So things I'm going to talk about are, I'm going to focus on a little bit on what readers look for when they look at your paper, what journal editors do when they're trying to decide if they're going to publish your paper, and maybe try and let you think about it in those terms. I think it'll help you, focus on what you should be writing. What makes a good and a bad paper. And I'm going to go through kind of in detail each section of a manuscript, what I like to do, some style issues. Now I'm not going to tell you how to write. I'm just hopefully can maybe give you a structure as to how to make it easier for you and give you some tips that I've learned myself going through the process many times. So the first thing, you may be wondering, why am I bothering with this? Like, what's the point of publishing? It seems like a chore. It's distracting you from learning about clinical medicine. So you could be the idealist. You could think you may do it because you just like science and for the love of learning, and that's great. That isn't everybody. Take it from me that later in your careers, a purely clinical job can become a bit of a treadmill, and having something else that you do, having another interest, is a really valuable thing. And this is really how you set about it. By publishing, you leave yourself open to lots of other opportunities that can sit alongside your clinical career and make it more interesting. So if you're a pragmatist and that doesn't appeal to you, just at a very fundamental level, publishing something at this stage or soon opens doors for you. It'll get you on the SHO scheme you want. It'll get you on the SPR scheme quickly. It'll get you a consultant position ahead of someone beside you. It'll give you the opportunity to travel overseas at any stage. You'll get invitations to speak, overseas or in other institutions. So it's, there are a lot of very specific advantages to doing this, to getting involved in this now. All right. And the slogan is publish or perish, but sometimes there's a bit of a division people view between the research work they do and writing it up. But you've got to understand that the paper is your research. That is the thing you're going to be judged by. So you can do all sorts of great work yourself on something interesting, but until you write it up, you haven't done anything. Okay, there's nothing to measure you by. So the action of writing up is everything, and you've kind of got to get over the barrier of writing, and it's got to stop being something painful or something that you dread for you to become an effective researcher. So I should change the title of this. I used to think I was terrible. I was terrible at writing. I really was. Like, I remember in medical school being taken aside and told that, you're someone who, you do well in classes, you do well, you speak up and you say interesting, or you say things that are correct, you seem to know what you're talking about, but your writing is terrible. And it was really letting me down in exams, and I was shown back what I'd written in exam situations, and it really was dreadful. Like I remember in the exam situation, people around me would be filling booklets with lots and lots of lengthy answers to questions, and I'd be just kind of really focusing on a few detailed lines, and I'd look back, I might write 2 pages in a response. So I really had no structure for what I was doing. I knew the stuff, but it just wasn't out there. So for people like me who are bad at writing, actually this is an area that was kind of refreshing, because I was quite good at this. And the reason that this kind of writing suited me, and can suit you all, is that there's a structure to it. There are elements that have to go into a scientific paper. They're expected, and if they're not there, people will wonder where they are. There's a set order for the way things should appear, and when you've gone through that, you've filled in all those sections, you're done. All right. So it's quite formulaic. It doesn't mean it's like a passive lab report. There is scope for style and good writing, definitely, but ultimately there's a structure that has to be adhered to, and that's helpful. That said, it's generally done very badly. So a good writer with good foundations in the basics can do very well. This is the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, and he said, clearly, in all disciplines of science and medicine, researchers continue to struggle with communicating clearly. This is particularly evident in peer-reviewed manuscripts, which are often deficient in clear, logical writing. Because something seems to happen to people when they write up their reports. They just stop writing the way that they speak. and I think that's something to adhere to. So when a reader looks at your paper, I think you should kind of put yourself in the position of the reader when you're thinking about how you're writing your paper. So it's probably unusual for you to take a paper, start at the top, read right the way through, and put it down and go on to the next one. There are sections that you're more interested in, and they have to be perfect. So most people pay attention to the title. If the title is poor, wordy, or off-putting, that often is enough to send someone away. And most people really will, 9 times out of 10, just read the abstract. That's what's available on PubMed. That's, and beyond getting, so often you have to get beyond a paywall to get any more information. So although the abstract is something that's written late in a lot of cases, that's the bit that's read by most people. Most editors will make their decisions based on that. So if you've got to really pay a lot of attention to your abstract, it's not a sort of an afterthought. Your figures and your tables should be entirely self-contained. If you think about presentations you've seen, people will often just put up a table from a paper. So if the table has to kind of stand alone, all right? Again, it's not just something at the end of your manuscript, it's kind of the core of your manuscript, really. And it's often the only bit that'll get out into the public view. You should try and make your figures look good because, again, they've got to fit in with presentations. And your paper has to have a clear take-home message. So until you decide what the message of your paper is, you shouldn't really be writing. You need to have a kind of a feeling for what you're going to say. When a reviewer is looking at a paper, what they're looking for is structure. A clear structure implies someone who's organized, who understands what they're doing. Because you've got to understand the reviewing process involves a lot of trust. People are trusting, based on what you've written, that you've done these experiments thoroughly and objectively and without bias. And there's a way in which your writing communicates that. So if you write in a clear way, and I'll show you how to do this, it implies that you're an organized thinker. Having lots of small errors in your manuscript implies that you are sloppy. You mightn't be, but it implies that you are. Silly spelling mistakes that could have been corrected with a spell check. That tells me this is a person who has kind of rushed through this. They didn't take the time to go through even a simple step to correct those things. And then I'm kind of going to think, well, this is someone who hadn't spent the same time on the experiments. They were similarly sloppy there, and I'll reject it. So they're easy things that you shouldn't be tripping up on. As I said to you, a lot of people will just stop at the abstract, so that's got to be perfect. Most editors would say that after they've done with the abstract, they'll go straight to the tables. And after that, they'll go straight to the first paragraph of the discussion, and I'll show you why they do that in a second. So this is a paper just that goes through the commonest reasons for papers to be rejected. So the commonest reason for a paper to get rejected are ambiguous or unclear methods. This isn't that surprising. People dread writing the methods. It's sort of the area that, and people often end up copying and pasting them and things like that, and I have a lot to say about that. But so you really got to make sure your methods make sense to you and that you can explain them to people verbally before you start trying to write them. Because people often struggle with this section, they'll often just copy and paste, and that's just a complete red flag to a reviewer, and they'll just get rid of your paper as a result. The second reason that papers get reviewed is that the results are ambiguous. So an ambiguously presented set of results, in other words, they're kind of conflicting and they aren't moving in a clear direction, that this is a positive or a negative study. That, again, suggests that this hasn't been properly thought through. Maybe there were elements of the experimentation that hadn't been, maybe there were other experiments that could have been done to clarify these results. And if that hasn't been presented, again, it's kind of not something that is viewed as being publishable. Making conclusions that aren't warranted by the data is very common, particularly when you start off writing. And I'd really strongly encourage you to be quite humble and circumspect in the conclusions you draw from your study. All right? All studies have limitations. Very few studies make a big impact in clinical practice. There's no shame in that. So you should be writing up in a way saying this is an interesting finding. It suggests that we maybe could do further work in this area. That's what most studies end up showing. So drawing big, profound conclusions from a small clinical study is the turnoff. Poor referencing is really important. References are your friend. By gathering together high quality references in your area of interest, that is randomized control trials and peer-reviewed journals, quality observational studies, things like that. Having quality references is a sign that you've done a good literature search, but it also helps your paper get found because people who look for those papers will be linked back to your paper through the referencing through referencing algorithms. So it actually increases the profile of your own paper. If you use a lot of poor quality references from small journals or books, that essentially means your own paper will be hard to find. This inadequate study design description really comes back to the methods, and I'll touch on that in a second. The tables, as I'll go on to show you, the tables for me are the beginning of the paper. I don't do anything else until the tables are perfect, or at least filled in. So as I said, your table should stand alone, and having poor quality tables is something that is highlighted as a reason for rejection half of the time. Having a long discussion is a problem, and that should be reassuring to you. You don't have to sit there thinking, how am I going to fill out this whole discussion? It's the other way around, actually. There are little bits there are sections that have to be filled in. And when you've done that, when you've filled in all those areas, you're finished. You don't have to think of 7 pages of material to come up with. You've got a job to do, to put your findings in a particular context, and then you can stop. So going on too long is a negative. And then not defining your terms is also a problem. So the conclusion drawn from this particular study was that manuscript preparation is a more frequent reason for rejection than the study issues itself. So that's an important point to take home. Okay, a section didn't come out here. There are 2 figures that didn't translate here, but this is essentially focusing again on the methods issue. So when editors were asked what section contains the most flaws, they overwhelmingly state it's the methods is the problem, and similarly, what section is responsible for rejection? In about 70% of cases, it's the methods. Other things that editors really respond negatively to are bad writing style, we'll touch on that, or using a lot of jargon. So as I say, writing as you speak, speaking clearly or writing clearly in a manner that you would when you're talking to a colleague is very important. And then issues I've touched on already about presentation and poor design. So the qualities of a good manuscript are that you have a descriptive and specific title, a descriptive specific abstract that doesn't go on too long, that adheres to the journal specifications, a short, focused introduction, a clear statement of your research question at the end of that introduction, literature that is comprehensive and relevant, methods that can include enough information that somebody else can repeat your study, standalone figures, standalone tables, and citations that are relevant to the topic. And I'm going to talk a little more about the discussion in a bit. Okay, so as I say, you should write like you speak. One of the hardest things to do, I think, is to try and write up on your findings with other people's papers in front of you. It's very tempting to do that. It's kind of a crutch, but it's like trying to hum a song with the radio on. You can't find your own voice in that context. So you should really do some background reading, and then put everything away and just try and write. And get your ideas down. They don't have to be perfect in the first instance. Just, you can flesh them out later. But you won't be able to kind of really think straight with other people's papers in front of you. And a lot of people, when they write, go through a very painful process of kind of trying to synthesize all these other people's work, compress them, change the words around, and it becomes very unfocused and it reads very badly. So put it all away. Think about something simple, a few simple points you want to make about each section, and just write them. And be brave about that. Be brief. So every word should have a purpose. So what I'm going to go on to recommend is that you will go through, put your ideas down, and then you kind of go through a process of editing. You might go through 10 or 11 versions, which sounds like a lot, but it happens quickly, where you're going through cutting out unnecessary words, cutting out sentences that don't have a really strict purpose, removing value judgments, taking out words like surprising or interesting or unfortunately, which don't have any role in scientific writing, and then stopping. As I say, when I would write up a paper, I'll end up having maybe 15 or 20 versions of the paper. Essentially, every time I go back to the paper, I start by editing it to get me kind of back into how I was thinking at the end of the last writing session, and I save that as a new version. I don't delete anything, because you never know when you come back when something might be useful or something you wrote before will actually become relevant again. So nothing gets wasted, but you're constantly moving forward and refining and trimming. Okay, I think I said all those things. Okay. not really for me to tell you how to write. I don't want to be like that. But just these are a few common language errors just to be aware of. So it says be more or less specific, i.e. you've got to be very specific. Avoid cliches like the plague. Verbs has to agree with their subjects. Prepositions are not words to end sentences with. And don't start a sentence with a conjunction. It is wrong to ever split an infinitive. Parenthetical remarks, however relevant, are usually unnecessary. Also, never ever use repetitive redundancies. No sentence fragments. Contractions aren't good style and shouldn't be used in formal writing. Do not be redundant. Don't use more words than are necessary. One should never generalize. Eliminate commas that are unnecessary or that are not necessary. And never use a big word when a diminutive one could suffice. Understatement is always the absolutely best way to put forward earth-shattering ideas. And use the apostrophe in its proper place and omit it when it's not needed. So, but writing style is something personal. You need to, I'm not going to focus on that. And the last thing you want is for your research mentor to be correcting that sort of aspect of your paper. So that's personal to you. What I'm going to talk about now really is more the structure of putting the paper together and how to go about it. So the first thing I'd recommend as a simple practical thing is whatever journal you intend to submit to, you should early on download their author's instructions. Okay, they'll tell you exactly what the word counts are involved, how they want you to structure the abstract. So they'll give you very clear guidance, and it saves you going through a whole step later on of just having to revise the whole manuscript. Generally, this is the order in which you'll present information. So it's title, abstract, introduction, material, methods, etc. I don't write a paper in that order, okay? I think that there's a more sensible way to do it. So the first thing I do, I always recommend if you're doing a new project, is to write a proposal. Not because it's an extra step of work for you, but actually it's starting the process. The proposal really has a very short point-by-point analysis plan, and it has an introduction. And that introduction, as I said, nothing is wasted. It's kind of the first attempt at the introduction that you'll use in your paper, because you've got to present this as a proposal to other people. So you kind of have to use the same elements of an introduction that you would in the paper. You're doing the same thing, really. So I think you should do an analysis plan. It also forces you to think about the sort of problems you're going to encounter and the steps necessary to do any sort of analysis. The next thing I do are table shells. So table 1 is usually always the same. It's usually the baseline characteristics of your study, and then you might have 1 or 2, 3 more tables presenting your results. But thinking through that process, what am I going to show? Using other papers that are similar to yours to kind of look at the kind of information they've presented, and actually making the physical shells is useful to you. It's also useful to you if you're using an analyst, so you can actually say, this is the format I want the information presented in, so you don't get 20 pages of output later that you've got to kind of reorganize. And that really introduces the possibility of introducing errors to your work if you're physically transcribing stuff. Whereas if you've shown the table shell to somebody, they can go right and they can fill that in for you, and it'll reduce the likelihood of making a mistake. Then I do an outline, which I'll show you how that works. And I generally start writing the results next. The results don't take any imagination. Writing results involves using dispassionate, objective language. This is the part that's most like a lab report from school when you were writing up a biology experiment or a chemistry experiment. You are just presenting the results of your experiments without any interpretation, just there for people to read themselves. So it's kind of easy to write, and you take it directly from your tables. Really, as I'll show you, your results section is just a walk through your tables. So once the tables are done, it's a logical part to do. It also focuses you in, and gets you thinking about what you've really shown. The next thing I would generally write are the methods, because again, they're very fresh. You've kind of just come from them, and I'll show you how I do that. The discussion comes next, and the discussion is the bit people worry about the most. It's one of the less common reasons your paper will be rejected. So, and it has to be good, but it's quite formulaic actually. There are sections that have to be filled out, and there's not a lot of imaginative composition in it. There are things that you have to put in there, so don't worry about how you're going to fill the discussion, which I think a lot of people do. Then I'll usually go back and I'll import the introduction from my proposal, and I'll usually be in a position then to make it look a little better. I'll refine it. Then I do the abstract and title. And then I go through a process of rereading, trimming down, rereading, trimming down, rereading, trimming down before I show it to anybody. So the outline I mentioned should really have a kind of a loose outline for each segment of the paper. As I say, it forces you to think through the steps in order. It kind of organizes your thinking and will identify flaws in your approach kind of early on. It tends to reduce wordiness, and it makes your writing ultimately easier. Okay, so as I said, I start with the tables and the figures. So the key properties of good tables and figures is that they're standalone and they're unambiguous. As I said, the editors will often look at these as the next thing after an abstract, and they will kind of judge your paper on how well you've done your tables. So put a lot of time into these. The captions you use with your tables they shouldn't just name the figure, they should actually explain to the reader how to interpret the figure. And they shouldn't rehash what's in there, they should actually give an overview as to how to interpret it. So this is what I mean by that. So this is just so for what I'm going to do at each step here is I'm just going to use a paper that I've written from a few years ago in Word format. So it'll be kind of the same as yours will look when you've gone through this process. And I'll just kind of, for each section, I'll show you just how it's done. So this is just, let's say, the table 1 from a paper that I wrote. So the title is clear and it's in bold. And underneath, I've written just how to interpret it. So it tells readers what the numbers are, what they're in bracket, and what the number in brackets means for interpretation. And then it's to be presented pretty clearly. Here I'm looking at quartiles of a particular biomarker and looking at characteristics of patients by those quartiles. So that's how I do now. And I did this before I ever started writing the paper. And similarly for results, you have a kind of a clear title on the top, and then I'm presenting comparison of these same quartiles of this biomarker and particular outcomes of interest. In this case, it was the development of kidney disease, but it could be a lot of other things too. This sort of information in text isn't appropriate. So if you find yourself writing a lot of numbers and brackets in text, that should be a table, okay? Whereas if you present this kind of information, where really this is just showing how the growth of a particular bacteria was influenced by putting oxygen into a tube, and you just show a difference in growth, plus or minus introducing oxygen, a very simple kind of yes-no issue, that doesn't belong in a table. That's a line in the text. So deciding what doesn't go into the table should be sensible and logical. This is an example of putting a lot of redundant text alongside a table. So really this person here has just plucked out the p-values and findings from the table and presented it a second time at the side. It's confusing. It takes a kind of bit of effort to work out what they've done. That's not what you want to be doing. It's redundant. What you want to actually do is present something that helps the reader get their head around the table. So here they say, look, this table shows the mean birth weight by BMI categories, and they even include some interpretation, which is a stylistic thing. They say the lower the BMI, the greater the effect of zinc supplementation. That's the kind of caption you want to have. It's standalone. You can see that and make something of it. Next section is the results. So really you're trying to say, what did I find? So having done your tables, this section is all about walking them through the tables one by one, sequentially, starting with table 1. It's very important when you're presenting your results that you call out each table. You don't omit anything. So you start with saying table 1 shows the baseline characteristics of our cohort. You don't regurgitate all the content of the tables. You just direct the reader to them. If you want, if you think there's an interesting trend in your table 1, you could say, table 1 presents the baseline characteristics of our cohort. We observed an increased prevalence of diabetes in the group that had kidney disease or something. That helps the interpretation, but it's not necessary for you to start transporting lots of numbers across. If you're presenting data in the results that isn't in a table, you need to state that. So you need to say data not shown in the brackets afterwards. As I said to you before, you don't need to interpret anything. You just present it objectively. That's not where this belongs, okay? You should present your information in line with the story you're trying to tell. You don't need to, you need to have a kind of a logical sequence for what you're saying. Don't feel constrained by the actual chronological way in which you did things. You are kind of trying to communicate after all. And don't repeat methods here. People tend to do that. The methods are in a separate section. You just focus on what you showed. And I'm a big believer in subheadings. And in nearly all sections, I think you should use italicized subheadings to make it easier to understand where everything is, to show that you're organized. So this is what I mean. This doesn't project very well, but it's just a Word document. So the results section here, the first italicized subheading is baseline characteristics of the study. So I introduce it, and I say here, for example, the study sample characteristics appear in Table 1. I don't give any more information. I didn't feel there was anything else to say. Unadjusted correlation coefficients, et cetera, are in Table 2. And then I did feel there was some interesting elements just to highlight there, and I just include one more line there about correlation results from that particular table. That's the first part done. Then the next heading, it shouldn't just say, results part 2. It's introducing what the next section is about. So here it's saying, well, what were the levels of this biomarker in cases and controls in the study? So that's the next subheading, and then I do go on to describe that. Then the next part here is replication in the ERIC study. So you can see that, and the last then shows the meta-analysis of 2 studies. The principle here I'm trying to show you is that there's a kind of a logical sequence of events there. It's easier for the reader to follow what's going on. So I think it's something you should try and adhere to. Then the methods section, I mentioned a lot about this. So the real key message for methods is, could somebody else do the same study as you following the cookbook that you've given them? As I said, it's usually the weakest section. It's the commonest reason for a paper to get rejected. The real issues are, have the methods you've described, are they adequate to come to the conclusions you've come to? Why did you choose the test you chose? People, as they get more experienced in writing papers themselves, get kind of fixated on this issue. As they learn more about how to answer various scientific questions, they're more prone to criticize you for using more basic methods. So you need to really think about this. Have I really proven what I'm saying? And as I say, you should give enough information that someone else can do the study. Again, subheadings are really important. So here's the methods from the same paper. The first thing that you usually will describe is your population sample that you're looking at. So here I have study samples. There were 2 in this study, so I described them separately, Framingham and Eric. And the components are just, the content is pretty simple, but it looks like it's structured is the important point. In a lot of clinical studies, you're often interested in is a specific thing influencing an outcome of interest. So I know we're working on a project together and you're looking at biopsy findings predicting transplant outcome. That's kind of typical. You're saying, is this thing associated with an outcome of interest? So technically that's called an exposure. That's something you're exposed to, is that something that's influencing an outcome? It's an exposure. The other things that could influence that outcome are potentially confounders, or they're be called covariates. So the way you generally organize your paper is you describe the people involved, you describe the exposure of interest. So here, it was this biomarker CTGF, but it could have been something else. That's usually the next section, and that's described by itself under a new subheading. Then the covariates are usually things that, that you'll adjust for. I don't want to get too into the analysis side, but so this will be the potential confounders in your study. So they could be things like diabetes, smoking, cardiovascular disease. And you need to describe each one of those covariates that you use in your study and how that information was gathered, because that's really relevant. And the last part is the statistical analysis, and that can be hard to write. And you should, if you don't understand how the analysis went, you need to learn about it. So you need to talk to a statistician if you've used one, or you need to go to your methods, or you need to ask your mentor. But it's very important if you're going to write it that you understand it. And that's really where the learning comes. And it means when you come to do another study like this, you actually have the wherewithal to do it. You've been through it before. And that's the real learning part of this. Sometimes if methods are complex, it's useful to put a flow diagram like this, but I have never needed to do that myself. So it's very important to talk about plagiarism here, because the method section is hard to write. And people, as a result, default to copy and paste. And there probably was a time when you could get away with that to an extent, although it looks like, I'd say your paper was likely to be rejected just because the methods don't often make sense if you do that. That's just not an option anymore, okay? It's very easy now to identify plagiarized material. So if I was to say, how many consecutive words do you need to have taken from another person's work to be identified as plagiarized? How many would you say? So it's two unique words that sit together allow a decent kind of searching algorithm. Even Google can do this for you, as they can identify the source of it. So a good example of this was these two words, Veluvial matrix. You may have heard of this story. This is an inaugural address by the Dean of Medicine of the new Dean of Medicine in the University of Alberta just last year. And he was giving a speech which he plagiarized from a New Yorker article by Atul Gawande. And he used this term, Veluvial matrix, which doesn't really mean anything, actually. And that was the point of it in the original article. And students who were listening to him kind of said, I think I've heard that before, and just Googled those two words. And in real time, were able to identify that he had lifted his whole speech from somewhere else just by these two words, and were able to essentially get the story out. He lost his job as a result. This is an unusual story either. You probably followed in Germany. There was a politician who lost her job as well recently because of plagiarism in a PhD 30 years prior. So it's a big deal then if this comes up later, because there are a lot of people's on the paper with you that you need to think about. So let's say you're the first author, but you might have a lot of people who helped you along the way, senior authors. This is a disaster if it comes up later in your career. It essentially damages the reputation of everybody involved in the project. I don't want to frighten you. Just using two words that randomly come together doesn't make that doesn't make it plagiarism. But what it does mean is that if you do happen to use someone else's material, it's not hard to identify potential sources. And if someone wants to find out that you've lifted that material, it's very easy to do now. So journals will use a kind of a plagiarism check, which is kind of based on the Google algorithm these days. So they'll take all of your article and they'll just feed it into this search engine, and it'll look for phrases that crop up in other articles. And if there's enough of them, they'll double check it physically, and you'll be found out. So I really strongly advise against that. It's far better to write your own honest attempt at the methods and have someone else correct it and do it yourself than to be tempted to do this. So, the next section I write is the introduction. It's really just about background and significance. It doesn't need to be too long. It needs to be written with a particular style in mind. So unlike other parts of the manuscript, this is a persuasive piece. All right, everything else is presented in a sort of a more dispassionate way, but here you actually are trying to hook a reader in. You're trying to catch someone's attention. You're trying to clearly explain what your paper is about and why it's important, and you also need to explicitly state what the hypothesis of the study was. So I'm just skip through this. The technique I use is the funnel, which a lot of they teach children in the US, and I was never taught this, but I wish I was. And I think it's described best by Pixar. Pixar, for example, will use this to kind of guide their writers as to how to start new stories, particularly if they got writer's block. And it's this process of moving from a very general statement, and with each consecutive sentence, you are honing in, you are focusing in, and you are getting towards a final line, which in a research paper is always the same thing. It's your research hypothesis. You finish that, you state it explicitly. So Pixar, when they write a story, they'll start with this. The first line will be, once upon a time there was something. There was this, there was a toy cowboy, like for Toy Story or something like this. And then they'll focus in a bit more and they'll say, every day, it's still a general statement, such and such happened. And then one day, getting more specific, this thing happened. And because of that, again, getting more specific, this thing happened. And because of that, this thing happened until finally, and then you get to your point. So the idea of the funnel is you're moving from something very general to something very specific over the course of a few sentences. And I think that's very helpful. I think what I would tend to do is that every consecutive sentence will draw on kind of a keyword from the prior sentence, but just narrow in a little bit more, always focusing on the hypothesis. So this is an example of, this is the introduction from the last paper I showed. So again, the first paragraph, very general, has to kind of catch the reader's attention. You're really trying to show that the general topic that this relates to is an important one. So you'll often see this first line. It's like, whatever it is a major worldwide health problem and some supporting data. And that's really all the first paragraph is. It's kind of getting more focused in on chronic kidney disease, why it's important. And what I want to get at is the need. What I'm thinking all the time is, at the bottom of this is that I've got a biomarker that I want to study as predicting this important problem. So what I'm trying to get at here is that it would be great if we could predict kidney disease a bit better. That's really the first line. It's an important problem. I'm trying to predict it a bit better. And then I narrow in a bit more. I talk about, well, how could you predict this a bit better? What are the kind of elements of kidney disease that make it something that could be predicted? And that's all what my second paragraph is all about. And then the last paragraph, as I said, is an explicit statement of what your hypothesis is. So I said, we hypothesize that higher urinary CTGF levels may be associated with an increased risk of kidney disease. And then the next sentence is usually your aims, how you set about proving that hypothesis. So it's to address this question, we did X, Y, and Z. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And once you key into that way of thinking about it, you'll realize that nearly everything you hear in the media is built on that same idea. The idea of the fun, starting general. Don't you just hate it when this happens? And they're focusing on their point. Who likes? Well, generally they'll look for something to hook you in, and then it'll narrow down to their specific point. It's a very widely used technique, and I think it's very useful. Then the discussion. As I say, people spend a lot of time on this. This typo here, but these are the sections I put in my discussion. I actually use these subheadings. I've generally removed them before I submit it, but not always. And these are the elements you must include. So they're principal findings, Mr. P there, in the context of the current literature, potential mechanisms, implications, strengths and limitations, and conclusions. So the principal findings, really easy to write. You just decide, what have you found in your study, count them up, and present them. So you say, the findings of this study are threefold. They were bang, bang, bang. That's it. Okay? That's why editors look at the first paragraph of your discussion, because that's where you're just telling them everything they want to know in a nutshell. And it should be there. They're looking for it. Make it easy for them to find it. So put it there. So that's what I did here. Now I actually didn't include that first sentence here, but I should. That's a lot of other papers I have. It'll say the findings of my study are twofold. One, our data demonstrated significant inverse association, whatever you showed. But that's that first paragraph done. The next then is in the context of the current literature, and this is your literature review. It's you hopefully will have done a fair bit of this at the proposal stage, but essentially you've got to have a brief, well-written kind of synthesis of the literature on this topic. Similar studies, things that people who've tried to answer the same question that you have. The way to do it is to look at other studies and then compare their findings with yours. And then you need to unite your own findings and find some ways in which you think that your findings advance the literature. It's not okay to say our findings are consistent with what other people have shown. That's not interesting, okay? So think about it. How has this improved things? How has it added a little bit more to the story? Try and explain your findings if they're different to other findings in the context of the literature. You've got to kind of show how your findings fit in. So if they're very different to prior studies, you need to have an explanation for that, or at least have an idea. That's fine. That's everything I'd say about that. So here, in the context of literature, this is kind of all in this paper, which was about a particular biomarker. It was all about prior studies of that biomarker, first of all. And then the relevance that I had to keep remembering and thinking about when I was writing this is it's not just about this biomarker, though. It's about this biomarker in kidney disease. And that was another part that had to be covered, so I wrote about that. And then it also was relevant to studies of biomarkers in general predicting kidney disease, so it needed a little bit about that. So it's not just about, it isn't a case of just gathering together what's out there on a specific aspect of it. You've got to think about all aspects of this particular thing to write a very complete section. Potential mechanisms is next, and it's the only part of the paper where any speculation is allowed, okay? Everything else is based on data, based on your own findings. This is where you can hypothesize. You can say, well, maybe this is due to some, weird or wonderful explanation that you've come up with. You've got to kind of hold that urge back in every other part of the paper, even though you might think fantastical things about what you've shown. This is the only part where you can say it, and you've still got to kind of qualify everything. So this finding actually was one of those sort of weird findings that we didn't expect. So it did require a longer potential mechanism section to do it, and everything has to be referenced. You can't just speculate wildly, but you can kind of build up a theory based on the existing literature, so you've got to reference everything quite well. The next section are implications. You just need to, from talking to your colleagues really, it's good to talk through these things. Like think about what are 2, maybe 3 realistic implications from what you've shown. You're not going to, it's okay, you're not going to change practice with your study. You shouldn't be conscious of the fact that it isn't going to make a dramatic difference, but it might affect a few things. One important implication is it might lead to another study, and that's reasonable. That's what most things end up doing. Um, so here, let me see, findings of the present work. Okay, maybe we'll be able to predict future kidney disease because that ultimately was the point of the study to begin with. It also, I've just said here, it highlights the complex biology of the biomarker. I mean, that's not really saying very much, but still, it's an implication of it. You've just got to be a bit thoughtful about it. You are trying to sell what you've found as best possible to the reader. Strengths and limitations is often hurried through. It's a very important section, okay? It really helps you deal with reviewers in advance. So all studies have limitations. You can take the best multi-center, prospective, randomized trial, wildly funded, and it still is going to have limitations. So your small clinical study is going to have lots of limitations, so don't be afraid of that. Don't oversell your findings. You should be the harshest critic of what you've shown. It'll actually help you. What you do by identifying lots of limitations with your study, but then trying to kind of attenuate their severity by saying, okay, there were no African Americans in this study, but in other studies they've shown similar findings to our own. You can kind of get the criticism in first and actually take away some of its severity. What you shouldn't do is try and act like there were no limitations to your study, present it like it's a very dramatic finding, try and obfuscate or cover up the fact that the study isn't perfect. Because what will happen is, I guarantee you that no amount of clever writing is going to get past a reviewer. These problems will be found, and they'll appear like a much bigger deal. They'll either lead to the rejection of your paper without a review, or you'll get a reviewer who thinks they're done really well to identify this problem coming back at you and saying, look, this is wrong, this is wrong. So you can kind of, as I say, suck the air out of the room for a reviewer. They give them nothing to breathe with by saying, look, this is a problem, but it isn't that serious because it's consistent with prior studies, and this is a problem, but that sort of data isn't usually available in these types of analyses. So it's a very important section. And also remember to highlight the strengths at the start. So yeah, this is what we did here, the strengths and limitations in their own section. And usually try and finish on a positive thing, there are problems with the study, but these are interesting findings, and maybe it should stimulate an attempt to replicate these findings in a bigger study or in another study. And then the conclusions, they should match what's in the abstract. A good conclusion says things that have only become apparent or significant having read your paper. It gives you some perspective and insights about your findings, and it's about the implications of what the reader has learned. At this point, right at the end, I'm going to talk about doing the title and the abstract. Okay, the title is really important. A bad title is very off-putting, so it's better to kind of do it at the end when you know exactly what you've written. A lot of people use these sort of phrases in their titles: a study of, an innovative method to, investigations on. That's all terrible. It's very off-putting. It's boring. The best titles are sentences, and they'll have an action word in them. So here we have program death 1 ligand signaling regulates the degeneration of something. Here we have this 17 beta estradiol suppresses PTH-related proteins. Attenuates is a good word. Decreases is a good word. But having a sentence that describes what you did is useful. Here we have, from the same paper, lower levels of this biomarker precede incidence chronic kidney disease in the general population. And then last is the abstract. And as I said to you, it's the bit that really actually needs the most attention. So here's the editor of JAMA saying it's the single most important part of the manuscript. It's often the least well written. Decisions are often based on the manuscript. This particular writer says, for about 2/3 of the submissions seen during the study, editors were able to make their decisions completely based on the abstract. And for all the papers that editors thought should be rejected after the abstract, the final decision after they went through the whole thing was still to reject. And the reason you should write it last is the kind of things that reviewers will focus in on are differences between the abstract and the main body of the paper. So when you've written the full paper, then is the time to write it, because you can actually use the paper to kind of import in the information from your results section and other sections, and there won't be any inconsistencies. And that's important because when you structure your abstract, it's really structured quite similarly to the paper. or at least the kind of subcomponents are. So the background is like your introduction. I wish I had a pointer here, but your background is like introduction. Study design, right through to measurements, is really breaking down your method section. The results are presented just like your results, so the numbers have all got to match exactly. You've got a limitations and conclusion section. So this formatting was requested by the journal that we were using. I think it's a good format to use anyway, that you actually make sure that you include all these elements in an abstract, and it's very structured. And really, the whole paper could be nearly everything that's relevant in the paper can be drawn out from this abstract as a result. Kind of spoken a bit about references. The most important thing about references is to buy EndNote or a similar reference manager. Don't try and do them yourself. Don't copy and paste bits and pieces of references. You'll just get completely lost. These reference managers are really easy to use. They're a very good way of storing your references for later use. If later in your careers you end up writing on a particular area, which is often what happens, you get an area of interest, you can refer back to that reference database again and again and again. So just get used to it, use it now, it'll make your life a lot easier. And finally then, having gone through all that, you should never send anybody your first draft. You'd be amazed what you would see going back to a paper you've kind of felt you're finished with at the end of a long day's writing. So I will often put the manuscript away, come back to it, and when you read it again, there's usually tons of mistakes in it that I wanted to correct. So resist that temptation. When you're doing your final editing, you should really print it out. There's a huge number of, and read it aloud as well. Read it out to yourself, because reading off a screen, you'll encounter there's a lot of mistakes you just won't pick up. Things that people look for if they want to see if you've done things well are, do all the figures match up? Do the numbers in your results match the numbers in your tables exactly to the decimal point? So really be kind of scrupulous about that, and that's very hard to do on a screen if you're scrolling up and down. So having it in a paper format and writing it in is the way to go. And the last thing to say is that you're going to give this paper to people and they're going to criticize it. It's much easier for me, if you give me a paper, for me to say you did a great job, even if I think it was a terrible job. It's great. I just don't have to deal with the criticism. I don't have to deal with your disappointment. It's a soft way out for me. So someone who gives you negative feedback, focus negative feedback